Good evening. I'm John Page from Dymocks. Welcome to tonight's Chapter 1. Our very special guest tonight is award-winning author Maggie O'Farrell. I am a massive fan of your novels and your memoir. I have felt on more than one occasion reading one of your books, you reaching into my chest, reaching out my heart and throwing it across the room. I am so great to have you on tonight. Welcome to Chapter 1.
I don't think I've ever had an introduction like that. You made me sound like a cardiac surgeon, which I quite like. It's quite nice. It'll be a whole new for me.
I absolutely loved your latest book, Hamlet, which is here and out now. Just been shortlisted for the Women's Fiction Prize as well, and I'm sure there's going to be some more book prizes down the track. On the surface, Hamlet is about the devastating story behind the inspiration of William Shakespeare's most famous play, Hamlet. But in your wonderful hands, this extraordinary story is something else entirely. It's deeply personal and emotional and resonates long after you put it down and completely alters your perception of this famous play forever. When did you first learn about the story behind Hamlet, and what led you to write a novel about this real tragedy in Shakespeare's life?
Well, I first heard about the existence of the son, Hamlet, when I was studying the play Hamlet at school when I was 16. So that's a really long time ago now, about 30 years ago. And I had this really fantastic English teacher who's one of those teachers who really sort of really changed my life, actually. I met him at the right time and he really changed things for me. And he just mentioned in passing one day when we were studying the play that Shakespeare had a son who was called Hamlet, and he died aged 11, about 4 years before the play was written. And, you know, it's funny because even though it was a really long time, obviously I was a long way off from being a mum myself and also a writer, this story just really got under my skin. I'm not quite sure why, and the idea of this boy who was lost. And I think you know, when I went to university, I studied literature, and of course I was reading lots of books about Shakespeare, lots of criticism and lots of biography, and I was really astonished that not actually Hamlet, his story and the boy himself, was very little known. You know, I asked a lot of my friends who were studying literature like I was, and I'd say to them, you know, what were Shakespeare's kids called? And none of them could tell me, none of them had heard. And I'd say, well, you know, he had a son called Hamlet. And several of them said, you know, come on, that can't be true. It can't be true. You know, because the names, you know, obviously they're spelt differently, but in Elizabethan times, the spelling wasn't as stable as it is now. So they are actually the same name, literally the same name. And they are used interchangeably in parish records in Stratford at the time. So it just seemed to me, I don't know, it's a story that I've been really drawn to for about 30 years now. You know, because Shakespeare's a man who, you know, for all his extraordinary output of plays and poetry that we still have today, no thanks to him, thanks to his two friends who collected them up and published them after he was dead. But for all that, we actually know really very little about him himself. You know, his whole biography and his whole story are filled with voids and longueurs and these gaps. But it seems to me that this calling, you know, your most famous tragic hero and possibly your most famous tragic play after your dead son is not nothing. You know, it speaks enormous volumes. It's telling us as readers and as an audience, you know, it's telling us the depth of his terrible grief for this poor boy. So it was just a story that I couldn't leave it alone, or it wouldn't leave me alone. One of the two.
And you say we don't know much about this. I mean, there's gaps in Shakespeare's biography, but we don't know very much about his wife, Agnes, either. And that was one of the elements I really enjoyed most about this novel was Shakespeare isn't the central character to this story. He's often off stage. He's never referenced to as William Shakespeare or as the playwright that we know him as. He's known as the gloveman's son or the Latin tutor. But instead, Agnes is the central character. And she's kind of been consigned to history in a way as being the wife of the famous playwright and nothing more. Why did you choose to tell the story from Agnes's point of view?
Well, it was one of those things that I think often happens when you're writing a book. You know, you think you're writing a book about one thing, about X, but actually often by the time you finished it, it turns out that it was actually about Y and Z instead. And I originally conceived the book, you know, it's a book I've wanted to write for a long time, and I sort of had several goes at it actually, but actually I sort of swerved off each time I decided not to do it, and I went off and wrote 3 other books instead of writing this one. But actually when I originally decided to write it, I thought it would be about fathers and sons, you know, almost like the play is. But actually the more research I did into it, the more I read around the subject, because there are countless books about Shakespeare. You could actually spend the rest of your life reading about him, and plenty of people do. But I think what shocked me the most, actually, that really surprised me, was how much vilification and criticism and hostility, actually, the woman we know as Anne Hathaway has attracted. If we think we know very little about Shakespeare, we know so much less about her. There were documents about her. You could probably, you could count them on one hand. There isn't even a record of her birth. She was born before parish records were kept. But I think what's happened is, one biographer describes her as the wife-shaped void. But what seems to have happened, for some odd reason, I don't know why, is that everybody's rushed, or quite a lot of people actually have rushed for 400 years now, have rushed to fill this void with criticism and sort of hostility. If you ask an average person in the street what they know about Shakespeare's wife, they will probably say one of two things. They'll say that he hated her, or that she tricked him into marriage. And, it is true that she was 26 and he was 18 when they got married, and that she was pregnant. But, as the last time I looked, getting pregnant was kind of, the act of two people, not just one. And yes, he was a lot younger. But actually, there's no evidence that he hated her. And people will bring up the second best bed, the famous sort of behest in the will. But what I only realised when I saw the will was that actually the second best bed is an interlineation. It's squeezed in between two other lines. And the will is actually a very strange document. It is devoid of any kind of affection or emotion, and certainly any of the kind of lexical skill, obviously, he's famous for. But also the two things that struck me the most is that at the end of Shakespeare's career, when he retired, he chose not to stay in London, but he chose to go back to Stratford and live with her. And that doesn't seem to me the act of a man who hated his wife. And the other thing is that, by the time he retired, he was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He was an incredible, as well as being not a bad playwright and an actor, he was an astonishingly good businessman. But he earned a huge amount of money on the stage and through his writing and through the company of men. But when he was in London, he lived in really, really modest lodgings. So he basically rented himself a kind of monk's cell in East London, Bishopsgate. But he sent every penny he owned back to Stratford, where he bought his wife and daughters a year after Hamlet died. An enormous house, it's absolutely vast, with huge amounts of land, where his wife ran a very successful malting business. But he also bought cottages and land and fields, and what really interested me, one of the questions that really intrigued me while I was writing the book was I was wondering how the people of Stratford at the time saw him. They probably didn't see him as this genius playwright, or as this. They probably thought him a slightly loose sort of actor, because the acting world had such a kind of reputation for being slightly dodgy. But also, they probably saw him as a businessman and as a landowner, because a lot of people in Stratford had to pay him rent. But sending all that money back to Stratford, it doesn't imply to me that he regretted his marriage and wanted to avoid his wife. So that's a very long answer to a very short question. Sorry.
That's a great answer. Did you want to read a passage from the book to kind of show everyone how you get Agnes's point of view?
Sure. Yeah, so this is actually from the Latin tutor's point of view. I don't name Shakespeare in the book. I couldn't do it. I couldn't write his name in a kind of fictional sentence saying William Shakespeare came downstairs and had his breakfast. I just felt like an idiot the minute I wrote that down. So he had to be completely nameless. Also because I wanted him to be a little bit off stage. I didn't want him to be the main character. Anyway, I'll stop talking now and read instead. On a morning in early spring, a Latin tutor is standing at the window in Hewlan's farm, absently tugging on the hoop through his left ear. He is watching the trees. His students are behind him. They are conjugating verbs, temporarily unheard by the tutor, who is intent on the startling contrast between the sharply blue spring sky and the new leaf green of the forest. The colours seem to fight, vying for supremacy, vibrancy, the green versus the blue, one against the other. The children's Latin verbs wash over him, through him, like the wind through the trees. He is just about to turn and face his pupils when he sees from the trees a figure emerge. For a moment, the tutor believes it to be a young man. He is wearing a cap, a leather jerkin, gauntlets. He moves out of the trees with a brand of masculine entitlement, covering the ground with booted strides. There is some kind of bird on his outstretched fist, chestnut brown with a creamy chest, its wings spotted with black. It sits hunched, subdued, its body swaying with the movement of its companion, its familiar. The tutor is imagining this person, this hawk-taming youth, to be some kind of factotum to the farm, or a relative to the family, a visiting cousin perhaps. Then he registers the long plait hanging over the shoulder, reaching past the waist, the jerkin laced tight around her form that curves suspiciously inwards. He sees the skirts, which had been bunched up, now hastily being dragged down around the stockings. He sees a pale, oval face under the cap, an arched brow. He moves closer to the glass, leaning on the sill, and watches as the woman moves from the right to the left of the window frame, her bird riding on her fist, her skirt swishing around her boots. Then she enters the farmyard, moves through the chickens and geese, around the side of the house, and is gone. He straightens, his frown vanished, a smile forming under his scant beard. Behind him, the room has fallen silent. He recalls himself, the lesson, the boys, the verb conjugation. He turns and arches his fingers together as he imagines a tutor ought to do, as his own masters did at school not so long ago. Excellent, he says to them. They look towards him, plants turning towards the sun. What is the name of that serving girl, he says. The one with the bird. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Maggie. Thank you. At the heart of this novel, it is a portrayal of a grief that's so profound it did inspire one of the world's most famous plays. Grief plays a significant role in many of your novels. What draws you towards grief, and why do you think you're able to capture it so powerfully in all your books?
Well, I think partly what spurred me on with this book is that I don't feel that Hamlet, the boy, has been given his due, actually. I think he's been quite neglected or forgotten by history. You know, if you read those huge sort of 500-page biographies of Shakespeare, Hamlet, the son, maybe gets 2 mentions if he's lucky. You know, they'll mention that he was born and then they'll mention that he died. And usually his death is followed by several paragraphs about statistics of child death in the 16th century, which of course was very high. I mean, the average life expectancy was 46, so I'd have clocked it by now. So it's just, I don't know, I always feel as though he's been really elided over and kind of ignored. So I suppose I wanted the book to be about grief, because it always seems to me that if you read the play Hamlet, wearing the spectacles of the awareness of the boy and this dead son, the whole play completely changes. You know, you see it in a completely different way. You know, the idea that they're seeking this ghost, and the father and the son, and the changing of places, and you know, and the other thing that interested me, you know, because I studied the play when I was a student, and I went back and read it when I was about to write the book, and it's odd reading it as a mother, you know, because I think that there's quite a lot of scholarly debate about how old Hamlet is supposed to be, this Prince of Denmark. He's a student, so is he a teenager? Is he in his 30s? Is he in his 20s? But it's odd, when I read it, and having got teenage kids myself, he just seemed to me, I thought, my God, this boy is 15. He seems so clearly that sort of developmental stage, you know, because he just had that kind of air of an adolescent who's been yanked too quickly into an adult world and into these kind of very confusing events. You know, his father has been murdered, his mother's married, his uncle has now assumed the throne, which is supposed to be his. You know, he seemed to me like this man-child who'd been forced, you know, much too early into an adult world. And it just very clearly, I thought this boy is 15, which is, of course, how old Hamnet would have been when Shakespeare wrote it, which is really heartbreaking. But I suppose as grief as a subject, so I suppose, you know, this book I knew was going to be about grief, and there would be this central event. You know, I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say in the middle of the book, Hamlet dies, you know, and Agnes, his mother, has to lay him out for burial. But in a sense, I wanted it to be a book about grief, but also about recovery. So, you know, it's also about the kind of different ways that people will deal with grief, because obviously I think the family must have been shattered by the death of this child. You know, he was 11, you know, how could it not have affected them absolutely profoundly? And I suppose that's what I was fueled to write it, because I felt angry, in a sense, with these biographers who basically were implying that his death was actually no big deal because lots of children died, and so they would have expected it. So this kind of, I felt so sort of, I mean, in a sense, sort of fury or injustice is quite a useful fuel to write a book, because I thought, no, I want to write this boy as a 3-dimensional character, and of course his death was important. You know, not only did he inspire this play, but what about his sisters and his mum? You know, it must have been an enormous impact on them. You know, the fact that he was a twin, and boy and girl twin, you know, he had a sister Judith who was his twin, and an older sister Susanna. But the fact that, you know, there are so many boy and girl twins who are separated and then magically reunited in Shakespeare's work is just, it's so heartbreaking to think of. One of the saddest things actually I discovered, I think, when I was researching the book, was that Twelfth Night, which was written a year or so after Hamlet, the opening night at the Globe Theatre in London was on the twins, what would have been the twins' birthday. So
Wow.
Hamlet would have been dead for, I think, 6 years at this point, 5 or 6 years. But that's the night. The opening night was the date, obviously, that Shakespeare must have chosen, and it was Hamlet and Judith's birthday. So sad. And of course, Twelfth Night features a boy and girl twins who are separated and then brought back together by marriage.
Oh, so yes, there's so much more than just Hamlet that inspired his writing.
Yeah.
Not only do you capture the emotion of the death of Hamlet, but you also capture the sense of place and the time that Shakespeare grew up in and the home he and Agnes made together. What research did you do about the time period and Agnes's life? And did you feel constrained having to base your novel on real people and real events, unlike characters that you invented yourself where you can do whatever you want with them?
Well, in a sense, it was quite an interesting challenge, I think. I think that's really important when you're starting a new book, is to sort of set new hurdles for yourself. You don't want to keep writing the same book over and over again. So actually, it was really interesting working within the parameters of what we do know about these people. But in a sense, as I said before, in a sense, it was quite useful because there are these huge gaps. So as a novelist, those kind of voids can be quite interesting because you can rush to fill them with whatever it is you want to say. But I did try really hard to use as much of the detail that is available to us as possible. But one of the most amazing things, of course, about the book is that for however we do know so little about Shakespeare, there are only 6 examples of his signature in existence for and also his library. He would have had an extensive library, and that's lost. There is a theory that it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London, which is certainly feasible. But what's extraordinary is that if you go to Stratford upon Avon, you can walk into the house where he was born. You can stand in the dining room where he would have taken his meals. You can see the bedroom he would have shared with his brothers. You can see the room where he was born. And it seems astonishing, actually, almost sort of unreal, the fact that this house has survived when everything else about him has been swept away. Nothing exists, or very little exists. But yeah, it's amazing. And the layout, if you walk around the streets of Stratford, the layout is pretty much as it would have been then. You can see the grammar school where he was born. You can see the church where he's buried, where his children are buried, where his wife is buried. Sadly, as you may know, there are no descendants of Shakespeare. Judith had 3 sons, all of whom died. One of whom died in infancy and 2 died in their early 20s. Susanna had 1 daughter, but the daughter married twice, but she never had any children. So there are no direct descendants of Shakespeare, unless, of course, there are some in London, which is possible. You never know. Outside wedlock. Maybe there are Londoners today walking around with a little bit of Shakespeare DNA in them. I hope so. I can't remember what we were talking about now. Oh yeah, research. So in terms of kind of bridging the gap between our lives today and the lives of people in the 16th century. It was so enormous. It seemed the more I kind of read about it, the sort of more distant I felt from them. It's funny. I've seen other writers of historical fiction say, oh, but these people were just like us, and I didn't find that at all. I thought, these people, it's so different. I was looking at the lives, particularly the kind of domestic lives of the women in the house, and it just kind of made me so grateful to be born when I was. The fact that Shakespeare's mother, for example, had 8 children in the house, and when William was 18, when he married Agnes or Anne, she also had, right the way down, she had all these age of kids, and the youngest was 2. You think the idea of bringing up toddlers and also these enormous, great dapping men, and every single thing those kids would have worn or eaten, she would have had to make, or somebody in the house would have had to make. The idea of feeding that number of people when you had to cook everything over a fire in a sort of outhouse behind the back of the house, and the bread had to be made, the flour had to be ground. It's astonishing, actually, when you think of the labour involved in the task, in just keeping the family alive. So actually, the useful thing I found, the useful thing I found, obviously there was a lot of library-based research, but particularly to write Agnes. Maybe I should mention why I call her Agnes. When I was researching the woman we know as Anne Hathaway, I read her father's will. So her father died a year before she married William, and in his will, he describes her as my daughter Agnes. which would have been pronounced Agnes or Agnes, a bit closer to the French in Elizabethan times. So you can see why people might have shortened it to Anne. But I don't know, it just really struck me. I thought, my God, have we been calling her by the wrong name for 4 centuries? And so I wanted to restore the name that her father gave her to her. So that's why I call her Agnes in the book. But anyway, to sort of fully inhabit her character, I actually did quite a lot of sort of physical research, which was much more fun than sitting in a library. So one of the things I did was to plant an Elizabethan herb garden, an Elizabethan medicinal garden. And I'm not much of a gardener, but I did want to do that because, it seems to me that, not only have people sort of vilified her for so long, but I wanted to give the idea of this kind of partnership in their marriage, that they actually did love each other and there was a sort of form of creativity between them both. And one of the things that's always fascinated me about Shakespeare's writing is the sort of a huge range of his knowledge and the depth of his knowledge about so many different subjects. And there's a lot of metaphors and sort of references to plants. There's the 2 things in Hamlet, the play: plants, sort of herbology, the scene where Ophelia hands out plants to everybody when she's mad, and also hawking or falconry. And so I decided to give these 2 things to Agnes. So obviously when he first sees her, she's got her kestrel, and she's also got a great knowledge of plant law and cures and curses as well, actually. So anyway, to sort of understand, it's funny because you can read in a book, the leaves of comfrey were used for aching joints, but actually until you actually get the comfrey seeds, plant them, water them, dry them, grind them up, you don't really understand what that means. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to actually do it. So I still have it, actually, and I do make tinctures, which my kids always say, I'm not going to drink that. But but the other thing I learned to do was to fly kestrel, and that was one of the best things I've ever done.
Wow.
Actually. It's really hard work, but it was great. So I went down to the Scottish borders. So my sister is a vet; she teaches the vet. So one of her students had is a falconer, so she let me borrow her kestrel for several walks, and it was just that was a very fantastic, fun day.
That is amazing. That is an amazing story. Hamlet is unlike anything you've written before. And your previous book was also a memoir, so that was kind of broke the mold of your novels. What is next, Maggie O'Farrell?
Well, actually, I'll do something else different next. So coming out later in the year is a children's book, the first book I've ever written for children, and it's called Where Snow Angels Go. And actually, at the moment, because I don't know how long you guys are into a lockdown, but I think we're into our 5th week now. Which is fine, and we're all, obviously we're really lucky. We're all well, and we've got a garden, and we're all okay. We've got enough food, all that stuff. But it is, life is a bit monotonous, and there's a lot of bad, there's a lot of bad news on your web feed, on the pages of newspapers. But actually, one of the really fun things that's happening is that in my inbox, keep appearing these incredibly beautiful watercolours that are illustrating my kids' book, which is fantastic. So there's lots of really nice news coming in for me as well. But it's about a little girl who wakes up in the middle of the night and she realises the snow angel that she made in the snow the previous winter has come back. He's reappeared in her room and he's there to save her life.
Oh, interesting. So that'll be out this year, end of this year?
Yeah, I think in time for Christmas this year, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. Well, this is the point where we can throw open the questions to our audience out there. So if anyone has got any questions for Maggie, please type them in now. I'll just see if there's anything on. Here we go. So Katie's got, what was the most surprising thing you learned about Shakespeare that really surprised you when researching the book?
Well, I think probably, I think the most heartbreaking thing was what I mentioned when I was talking about the opening night of Twelfth Night. But actually, there were lots of kind of odd things that I learned about Tudor times, life in the 16th century, which is quite surprising. And my kids, and I would get quite excited by these things, and I'd want to come and tell my family at dinner time. But my kids limited me to one Tudor fact today. I was only allowed one, because otherwise I would go off on one. And my favourite Tudor fact, which I can share with you now, is that Tudor sheep in Tudor time, because of course Agnes her father was a sheep farmer, so Hewlands, or Anne Hathaway's cottage that's known now, was a sheep farm. But Tudor sheep were half the size of current day modern sheep. You see? Who knew that? But you really want a little tiny Tudor sheep.
Yeah. We could have just done a Tudor fact interview. So Nicole's got a question.
I could have rolled for hours. My kids will tell you. Probably not a good idea. All right, here's another one.
So Nicole's got, do you prefer writing contemporary novels or historical fiction?
Do you know, I don't know. It's hard to say. I really do. I really enjoy both. And I really enjoyed writing historical novels. But I think I would say that I tried, wherever possible, actually, not to sit down and think to myself, no, I'm going to write a historical, capital H, novel, capital N. I tried to approach it as I would have done any other novel, because I really have I think I have a bit of a horror of historical novels that wear their history too sort of portentously. I think you have to wear your research very, very lightly and not go into it too much. I love the kind of historical novels which don't sort of over-egg the idea that this is about history with a capital H. One of my favourite historical novels is Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey, and it's absolutely beautiful because he, you apprehend these characters just as real people, and the Victorian setting, I suppose what we call Victorian setting, is sort of incidental in a sense, and I think I wanted to get that same lightness of touch that Carey got in that book. So I tried sort of to push it out of my mind, actually, in a sense.
Excellent.
Love what you back. Is your name Anne Whately? That's incredible. That is the name that was entered. Oh, Anna Whately. That's really interesting because that's actually a misspelling of Hathaway. I mean, it's not a misspelling. Wow. It's an alternative spelling of Hathaway. The lady who's just asked this. So actually, in the marriage banns, this is a really good Tudor fact for you, Anna Whately. In the marriage banns, it's for Shakespeare and Hathaway, it is written as William Shakespeare, spelt with an X, and to Anne Whately, spelt exactly as your name is. Naming structure was a bit dodgy. My ancestor wasn't engaged to Shakespeare. Oh, that's a shame. You never know. You never know. And actually, is a version of the name At the Way, which meant that your ancestors, Anna, would have lived on a very important road at some point, and that's why they were called. So when people were given surnames like Cooper or Wheelwright, usually they were about their jobs, but Whately meant at the way, which meant on the road. So your ancestors would have had a house on an important thoroughfare. There you go, Tudor fact for you.
Double down. 2 for 1.
Just for you.
How do you? So now we've got a question from Lauren. How do you prepare to switch write something completely different, like jumping into writing a children's book, then historical or contemporary? So how do you prepare yourself to write?
Well, it's funny, writing a children's book was obviously probably the biggest gear change actually I've ever done. But in a way, it wasn't that difficult because I have kids, and the story is actually one which I made up for my kids. It was a sort of bedtime story that I kind of just evolved and I made up for them. And actually, my middle daughter has quite a serious medical condition, so she's prone to anaphylactic shock. And actually, the snow angel is a metaphor for anaphylactic shock. So when she was in anaphylactic shock, she often gets really, really cold because your heart rate drops. Sorry, this is a rather depressing thing to talk about. But so I made up this story about how actually it was a good thing when this happened because there was a snow angel and he was holding her with his wings that she couldn't see, so that's why she felt cold. So actually, from that evolved this whole book. But in a sense, it's, when writing for children, I actually just think of talking to my own kids and telling them their own thing. So it's not, but you have to be very careful with, in a sense, you've got to be quite careful with vocabulary. But, if I look at someone like Beatrix Potter, who I think is an incredible children's writer, she uses really very complex words. She uses the word soporific. Lettuce has a soporific effect in Peter Rabbit. And I always read that book as a child. I don't think I knew what soporific meant. But I think you, in a sense, when you meet that word later in life, you do have a sense because you understand that the rabbits went to sleep after eating lettuce. So I think in a way it's important not to talk down too much, but not to make it too complicated.
We got one from you from Sue. How has the lockdown impacted your writing practice?
Let's just say in terms of time, I don't normally homeschool 3 children, put it that way. So yeah, in terms of time, it's funny. I was sort of at the beginning of lockdown, I was slightly gnashing my teeth every time I saw those articles about, what's new skill are you going to learn with all your new spare time? Are you going to take up knitting? I would kind of think, what spare time? I don't have any. So in that way, but I think also, every situation teaches you so much, and I think it has taught me to really concentrate. I think I've probably had the tendency of being a little bit precious about sound. Actually, I need to be in total silence. I need to be quite. I need to feel as though I'm completely alone actually when I write, but that's not going to happen. So if
No.
My teenage son really likes rap music, so there's often a kind of really doof 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 beat going on. But I think I've had to learn just to kind of forget about it and just write whenever you can, because that's what you have to do. You have to write around the edges.
Well, it's almost been prophetic as well, because the plague had such an impact on Hamlet as well, that we wrote that before all this, and that's now fed into our real world as well. And there's been lots of referencing to the plays Shakespeare wrote during the plague as well.
Yeah, no, it is really strange. I mean, I certainly didn't see that coming, and certainly, I think the plague obviously was a huge and ever-present threat for. For people in the 16th century. And also, right the way. I think the last plague epidemic was officially ended in the early 20th century, I believe. So, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that they discovered the link with fleas. But certainly Shakespeare's career would have been repeatedly disrupted by the plague. He would have been, the first thing the authorities in London did was to close the playhouses, because, if you get, hundreds of people all squished together in the hot, midday sun watching a play, that's a lot of virus spreading right there. So they used to click to, and I think he used to. I think clearly that there's a lot of documentary evidence that he used to take his company on tour in Kent and Shropshire and the counties around London, and actually he was in Kent on tour when Hamlet died. So it's not actually known whether or not he made the funeral, which is really sad. But also, I suppose he would have probably come home to Stratford perhaps and written the play. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe he found it hard to write in a house with lots of children and lots of people. Who knows? But obviously not. I think he wrote King Lear, didn't he, in the plague year? So he was clearly not having too much trouble concentrating.
So I've got another question from Caroline now. What did you find the most difficult to write, the first or the final words?
Well, something I wish that someone had told me before I started writing books is that you don't always have to start at the beginning. I actually find beginnings very hard. And the beginning of books are often the part I rewrite and redraft the most, just try and pin them down and get them right. I think it's possibly because I'm not much of a planner in life or in fiction, actually. I have heard writers say that William Boyd, actually, for example, I heard him once speaking, and he said that he spends a year just planning exactly what every chapter is going to say before he even puts pen to paper or finger to keyboard. And I don't do that. I kind of tend to launch out. So I'm not always entirely sure what the book is about sometimes when I start it. So I think that's probably why. So actually these days I very rarely start at the beginning. I think you've just got to kind of plunge in wherever you can and write whatever scene you want to. I think that's really important, because I think there's great solace to be had in word count. You've just got to keep writing wherever you feel like writing in the book, on your first draft anyway. And then, once you've got 10,000 words, you think, well, I may not use all of it. I may just find a kernel of 1,000 in there, but at least I've got that to be going along with. It's sort of, you've got to think of it as kind of raw material, like a sculptor would think of clay, would approach clay or a block of marble. So I think first words are very hard, but you can leave those till the end. That's my theory.
Well, I always think that the opening of your novels are always very distinctive as well, because you never feel grounded when you start Maggie O'Farrell novel. You kind of always try to feel your way into it. I think that's an interesting way to start a book sometimes, kind of put you off kilter.
Probably echoes my experience of writing it, actually, John.
And we've got another question. Any book recommendations? This is from Julie, besides your own, of course.
Oh, God. Well, actually, what have I been reading recently? There's something I really loved, actually, which was my kind of first lockdown read, which was fantastic, was the old Filth trilogy by Jane Gardum. And these were written in the sort of, I think, 2004. There are 3 books. And the amazing thing, of course, about reading the first in a trilogy is it's just so thrilling, because you think, thank God, because I've got 2 more to go. So the first one's called Old Filth, and then it's called, is it Last Friends? Oh, yeah, The Man in the Wooden Hat, and then it's Last Friends. And so it's about a group of friends who meet in Hong Kong in the sort of 50s. And then it sort of follows them right from their childhood all the way to old age. And some of them have been kind of Raj orphans. So these are kids who were born in India or Malaysia and then sent back, so-called home, to boarding school. So it's absolutely fascinating book about old age and long lives. And also the kind of huge, because obviously they all grew up in the 20th century. So it's this huge tribulations and trials that they all go through. So it's an amazing book about survival and resilience, I think, and also friendship. Yeah, it's great. It's so absorbing and immersive. I would really recommend that.
And the Filth in Old Filth is an acronym, isn't it? It's a failed in London, try Hong Kong, I think.
I'd just like to say that is allergy.
Bless you.
Oh, sorry, it's hay fever. It's not corona, I promise you.
All good. So I think we've got time for one more question. Yes. So here's Michelle. So we've got a comment. It is true. Yeah. So your openings are. I love some. Like sometimes I'm always just not sure where we are and who the voice is, and it's just a great way of knowing you're reading a Maggie O'Farrell novel.
I think what's really important to me actually is that you never underestimate your readers. You know, I really don't like it when I read a novel and I feel as though the writer is spoon-feeding me every piece of information and every piece of sort of characterization that I need. I really like it when I feel a writer is sort of stretching you in a sense, when you've got to join the dots for yourself. And
yeah.
You know, I think I quite like the idea of being wrong-footed sometimes. You know, so I suppose you always want to write the kind of books that you like to read yourself. But I do think it's important to not underestimate the intelligence of your reader, to know or trust that they can join those dots themselves, so you don't have to give them every single piece of information they might need.
Okay, so we've got last question here from Lauren. So if you could meet one of Shakespeare's characters, who would you select and why? Oh,
that's a really interesting one. I really only choose one. I think I'd probably quite like to meet Ophelia. I think she gets a really rough deal. You know, I think she's got this awful kind of bossy father and this really overbearing brother. And Hamlet, you know, who I do love, I mean, he doesn't treat her very well. You know, he's in love with her and then he isn't in love with her and then he is, but he isn't. And he says he didn't send her letters when he did. And, you know, it's no wonder the poor girl goes mad. She just needs someone. She needs a friend, really. I'd quite like to be Ophelia's friend. And I just tell her, you know, forget it. Hamlet will come around. He's just going through a hard time. Everything will be okay. Forget your brother. He's just too violent and too hot-headed. You know, don't listen to him. And also your dad's a bit of a windbag. You know, you just got to grow up. Life's going to get better, Ophelia. I promise you.
Excellent.
And also, don't stop climbing on branches over brooks, please.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for joining us tonight, or your mid-morning. If everyone's out this... Beautiful stuff. We've hit our first winter day here down in Australia. It's been freezing, so...
Shall I give you a little flash of the weather here? Look, it's lovely.
Oh.
It's gorgeous. Spring sunshine, but then, you know, it's not really fair to, you know, I mean, you Australians get quite more than your fair share of sunshine.
We do, and we're complaining about the cold, and it's not really that cold. So, you know, it's all relative, isn't it?
It is in Edinburgh, I'm sure. Anyway, it's great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maggie. So, everyone, Hamlet is the latest book, but if you haven't read Maggie before, check out all of her past novels and her memoir. They're all fantastic reads. And thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us from the other side of the world. And this has been fabulous. And thank you for everyone for joining Dymocks' Chapter 1 tonight.
Okay, bye.
Bye.